Welcome to today's webinar, Eavesdropping on the Experts, 5 Emerging Trends in Cardiovascular Research. My name is Liz Schickling, and I am a marketing manager here at Worldwide Clinical Trials. Before we kick things off, I'd like to go over a few things. All attendees are on mute, but please use the questions window to submit questions at any time pertaining to the presentation, as we will be reserving time for a Q&A session at the end. This webinar is being recorded, and all attendees will receive an email with a link to access the on-demand recording. I would now like to introduce our experts who we will be hearing from today. Dr. Michael Murphy, Chief Medical and Scientific Officer, Tony Bransford, Senior Medical Director, Medical and Scientific Affairs, Karen Hill, Senior Vice President, Project Management, Cardiometabolic, Nancy Newark, Executive Director, Project Management, Cardiometabolic and Late Phase. And now, let's eavesdrop on these experts. To get started, I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Murphy.
You know, Tony, it seems to me that we're understanding so much more about basic pathophysiology that it's rapidly changing the way we do clinical trials. I'm particularly intrigued about some of the recent articles that have come out regarding the role of, around the inflammatory hypotheses. I mean, it's hard to keep up with you cardiologists. So, I mean, how do you see things? What's happening out there?
Well, thank you, Mike. Apologies for that. Yes, it is really interesting right now. I mean, we seem to be coming back into a golden age of cardiovascular treatment effects. So what I'm going to talk to you about initially is inflammation and cardiovascular disease. Now we all know that Paul Ridker has been involved in this idea of the connection between inflammation and cardiovascular disease for at least 2 decades now, starting with the Nurse's Heart Study. But if we look at Jupiter was the very first time that he was actually really able to show in a nice, concise way that if you treat to the inflammatory component, which is high sensitivity CRP, the inflammatory biomarker, with even stronger lipid-lowering agents. So in patients who had a low to normal LDL, they could still benefit from the inflammatory component of statin therapy by ultimately reducing their high sensitivity CRP. That was from the Jupiter trial. But no, he wanted to take it to the next level, and he did. At the European Society of Cardiology conference this past August, during essentially the Labor Day weekend, what we saw was a study that showed quite conclusively that if we treat cardiovascular disease with anti-inflammatory drugs, the one used in his trial was canakinumab, we could actually significantly reduce the risk of recurrent major cardiovascular events without any effect on cholesterol. And in a surprising twist, he was also able to show a dramatic reduction in rates of new lung cancer and lung cancer mortality. These cancers had been shown previously to be inflammation related. So in that study, he had more than 10,000 high-risk patients who had a prior MI and persistently elevated high sensitivity CRP levels, and showed that patients who received subcutaneous canakinumab, 150 milligrams every 3 months, could indeed experience a 15% reduction in risk of the composite of the primary endpoint, which was non-fatal MI, non-fatal stroke, non-fatal myocardial infarction or heart attack, non-fatal stroke, and cardiovascular death. And this was compared to patients who were taking placebo. And this was this was both groups on standard of care, very strong standard of care cardiovascular medications. Very nice results, really sort of laid the groundwork for other thoughts. What we're looking at now is a change in the paradigm of treatment of cardiovascular disease. The question in CANDOS was whether it would work in patients with established heart disease who have a high inflammatory burden as measured by elevated levels of CRP. and it did. Now, the drug works in rare rheumatologic conditions, but now it's been shown to work in cardiovascular disease. Very interesting. I don't know if anyone has any questions. If not, let's move on, because I had another thought. Another emerging risk factor, another emerging area in cardiovascular disease, what is diabetes and cardiovascular outcomes treatment. So what do we know about this? Well, first of all, we knew from IMPA-REG outcome study, which was a study in high-risk diabetic patients using empagliflozin to reduce as a primary endpoint cardiovascular outcomes. And what did it show? It was really amazing in that it showed quite nicely that there was a significant benefit to using empagliflozin. And as a result, empagliflozin is now standard of care. It now has labeling for reduction in cardiovascular outcomes in patients with diabetes. That's really sort of opened the door, because the next study, the LEADER trial using liraglutide, which was a GLP-1 receptor agonist, a newer agent used to treat hyperglycemia in diabetes, it's an injectable, was also performed, had also been ongoing during this whole event, during this entire episode, looking at, again, cardiovascular outcomes as a primary endpoint. And amazingly enough, it also showed a significant benefit using liraglutide compared to standard of care plus placebo. So what does that mean for us? Well, this also was discussed at the European Society of Cardiology. Multiple groups have been discussing it. The European Association of Diabetes has also been discussing it. They've actually had 2 diabetes and cardiovascular outcomes trial summits, and is looking to have a third within the next few weeks. And what we now have surmised is that A, cardiologists can no longer be afraid to employ diabetic agents to reduce cardiovascular outcomes in diabetic patients. So similar to decades ago, when we were not necessarily employing antihypertensive medications, we now obviously feel quite comfortable with utilizing these antihypertensive medicines to treat blood pressure, at least initially. We now need to develop that same comfort level for this next risk factor, diabetes, in order to reduce cardiovascular outcomes. But you know what, let's move on. What else do we have? I mean, this has just been a cornucopia of information in the past couple of years. The next thought that I had was to look at smoking. Now, smoking is lifestyle change, lifestyle modification. We all know that we need to discuss smoking cessation with our patients at every visit. We need to ensure, at least amongst ourselves, even if we don't, well, we clearly need to discuss it with our patients, but we also need to look at every person around and make sure that they have at least had some kind of a discussion about whether they are ready to quit, and encourage these people to quit. Actually, the FDA and other health authorities have guidance on how to assist these patients in quitting. Well, there's some new information out there. These smoking companies have been doing a lot behind the scenes to try and reduce risk, amazingly so. Some of these people, actually several of these companies, have harm reduction programs to show a reduction in benefit. The most recent alternative to smoking is the tobacco heat system. And what it does, it seems to look like that cigarette holder that was seen decades ago in the movies, or like with Cruella de Vil in 101 Dalmatians. It looks kind of like that, but about half the size. And what you can do is attach to it something called a heat stick, which is a very tightly compacted huge number of tobacco leaves that have not been crushed and essentially incinerated, but instead remain whole. Now, rather than actually burn them, they look to just heat them up to a certain level, about 300 to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The idea being that if you don't burn them, if you don't cause combustion of these tobacco leaves, you can prevent harmful chemicals from emanating into the air as part of the vapor, and thus significantly reduce the risk. Well, so where does that leave us? Well, the FDA is already looking at some guidance for e-cigarettes, and that should be coming out later this year or early next year with regards to risk, with regards to how to label these. That's coming. But other companies are also looking further ahead at other risk reduction programs, looking at these modifications to cigarette devices to try and improve the risk. And several of these companies have these things already coming out. They're either already out in the market in several companies, or they're looking to bring them into the market and looking to show that reduction in risk and how it correlates with the reduction in harmful chemicals that they have already seen, correlating that with comparing those devices to cigarette smoking. Now, lastly, if I could just bend your ear just a bit longer, we can talk about stroke. Stroke was a huge topic along with inflammation at the European Society of Cardiology. Why is that? That's because of the very large COMPASS study, over 27,000 patients, which was stopped early for, and I quote, overwhelming efficacy, according to the Bayer, AG, and Janssen press release. Now, the COMPASS study used as an intervention rivaroxaban, the well-known Xarelto. This was a phase 3 study, factorial design, in patients with coronary disease and peripheral arterial disease. So they had established atherosclerotic disease, very similar to earlier studies years ago, which were able to enrich these patient populations with higher risk events. They used two different doses of rivaroxaban and added it to aspirin. They also, because it was a factorial design, was able to look at rivaroxaban alone or aspirin alone. And what they saw was the reason why this trial was stopped early for efficacy. There was a really tremendous risk reduction when using rivaroxaban. Now, there was an increase in bleeding with rivaroxaban alone versus aspirin alone, but that increase in bleeding didn't change when you had the addition of aspirin. So the dual anticoagulation therapy did not reduce the risk of bleeding, but it also did not increase the risk of bleeding. On the other hand, the dual anticoagulation therapy significantly reduced incrementally the outcomes. So this was a really strong breakthrough, similar to what we see with CANTOS, the inflammation trial. With COMPASS, we anticipate that there will be some future change in guidelines. Right now, the guidelines for acute stroke and high-risk TIA, or transient ischemic attack, is for aspirin alone. Initially, before this came out, there was a push to change the guidelines to now include dual antiplatelet therapy, or aspirin plus a prasugrel or a clopidogrel or a ticagrelor. But now, with this drug coming out, it is a factor Xa inhibitor, an anticoagulant, which normally would fall into the realm of, say, warfarin, clear anticoagulant with clear risk of increased bleeding. I don't know, but I think that the guidelines will have to change. What do you think, Mike?
Well, I tell you, Tony, we knew you were going to talk about this today. So Liz and I created a poll question. We want to see where the audience is living in this regard, and I'd like to get your reaction to it. So here's the question, and we're going to give the audience a chance to react to it. And then, Tony, I'd love to hear your comments on it. So everyone on the team here, is your organization increasingly interested in the role of anti-inflammatory medicines in CV disorders? So we got to pick only one. Yes, it's on your radar. No, we haven't thought about it. But, now that you mention it, it's an area of interest. So we'll give you a minute or so to vote. And Liz, when you're ready, please show the results. Well, Tony, how do you read this one?
I think that's very interesting. It shows the good work that Paul Ridker has been doing, because I tell you, he has literally been the main proponent of treating inflammation and cardiovascular disease. Again, I tell you, this has been on his radar for 20 plus years, and particularly since the Jupiter trial was so astoundingly positive, he immediately went to Novartis to look at using their anti-inflammatory drug in cardiovascular disease. And again, he shows a very prominent, a very profound reduction in outcomes. So I am very pleased to see that it is on people's radar. Great idea, Mike.
Well, for me, Tony, I tell you, as a non-cardiologist, I have to ask the question, is immunology in everything? Is every single therapeutic area addressing this hypothesis? I know you had another study you were quite interested in as well that was examining this.
Yes, I actually do think it is turning towards immunology being a part and parcel with multiple disease therapeutic areas. It is looking like, I mean, as we've all known that CRPs are, that just a generic CRP, again, very generic. We see that, we saw that from medical school. It goes up, but it can go up with just about anything. But why is it just about anything? So we look at high sensitivity CRP, looking at minute increases in CRP, and we start to see that some of these diseases, or several of these, a lot of these diseases, actually do have an inflammatory component. Otherwise, why else would their high sensitivity CRP be increasing that minute level?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, Karen, it seems to me that, you know, one can imagine that types of studies are really changing the way that you need to organize and operationalize these programs. It's simply not the same environment as it was 10 years ago. And I'm particularly curious, from your perspective, about the role of academic research organizations as an example in this particular space.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. It's interesting because you talk about the changes over the last sort of 10 years or so, but actually I've worked in this field for just almost 25 years now, and we've actually collaborated with eminent academic research organizations for many, many years now, and have built strong relationships. So I'd actually like to ask another poll question of the audience, if that's okay, and that really is, how heavily, or rather, are you heavily engaged with AROs for program design? Are you aware of those organizations? Again, if you could just select one, and Liz will put up the result when we've got everybody voting.
Sure, Karen, just giving everyone a couple more minutes. There seems to be some votes coming in.
That's really interesting. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting. And Nancy and Tony and I in particular have been working in this, as I say, field for many, many years, and again, sort of have been very aware of these organizations. So let me sort of tell you a little bit more about the challenges of these large cardiovascular outcome studies and the future of research itself, and then we can perhaps talk a little bit more about how these organizations have certainly influenced the way that we've run studies in the past, and I think they will continue in the future. So just looking at some of the challenges, you know, there's always a high cost to these types of studies. I think Tony, Nancy and I were talking yesterday about, well, why is it that AROs are more dominant in the cardiovascular field, and why is it that these studies, you know, today even have tens of thousands of patients? And I think even if you go back to the early 90s, late 80s, you know, the first studies that we were looking at, the first thrombolysis studies, the first studies that were done by GISI and ISIS with aspirin and ACE inhibitors, they were huge studies even back then. So it's interesting to see that that's continued, and I think that's potentially a good thing, although, as I say, it does lead to then lengthy timelines on these studies. Typically, we would do a study that would recruit perhaps for 18 to 24 months and then have a minimum of 2 years plus follow-up once the last patient's actually been randomized. There continues to be, I think, an increased competition for qualified investigators and sites, and one of the challenges that we need to ensure that we approach is making sure that we've got the next generation of investigators and sites that we can draw upon. It's comforting to know that we are still working with investigators and key opinion leaders that were around many decades ago, but it's also very useful and enlightening to have those new guys come along and be able to work with new talent and people that have are working and sort of innovating these types of studies. Again, I've talked about large patient populations and long-term follow-up periods. Some of these studies I was looking at some data, and for a study where we were looking at diabetes patients and cardiovascular outcomes, we had over 66,000 patients worth of follow-up data. So, or follow-up years. So, it's a lot of data, it's a lot of effort. Regulatory and administrative barriers are also an area that we need to ensure that we cover. We need to understand the local regulatory environment. It's changing. We need to understand how we can make that more efficient. And sometimes our sponsors impose barriers, so it's very key to work with them up front, make sure that they also have the capacity and the ability to turn things around quickly. Even with large pharmaceutical companies that we've worked in the past, with a large team of local contract negotiators and a big team of CRAs working on a site level, we are generating lots of feedback back to a client from a legal perspective, and we need to ensure that they've got the resources also to be able to keep up with that. And often we find that it's actually the sponsor's ability to, or lack of resource that actually is slowing down that process in sometimes. So there's also, we need to ensure there's not a disconnect between clinical research and medical care. And Nancy and Tony will also justify this comment in that we have to find a very fine line between making it complicated for the sites, but also making sure that we're getting the data that we want. And therefore, again, working with AROs sometimes there can be a conflict of interest. We have a big patient population, we have a lot of data, we've got a potential for getting even more data, but it's critical that we don't overcomplicate our studies. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to find the patient, but also it's going to be difficult for the site. And again, it leads to expensive clinical research. So barriers at academic institutions, these would include, long contracting processes. We often find that sites are not equipped to provide documentation to us quickly, or need to have very lengthy internal processes before we can get contracts signed, or they require local IRBs or local IRB approvals before they'll start negotiating contracts. And then by nature, in order to get this many patients in these types of studies, we need to go to lots of sites, therefore we need to go to lots of countries, but also we need that patient population. I think it's critical, and it will continue to be critical in the future, that even though we perhaps are doing clinical research for, say, an FDA mandated study, or even to answer questions to the European regulators, it's important that we see patients from all geographies. Obviously, from a pharma company, that then means that they can have better access to those patients in the future. So going on to look at some of the key success factors. So we mentioned AROs and CRO partnerships, and what does that really give us? And I think the main thing that it really gives us is access to good site identification. I think we've all worked in studies where it's very easy to see on paper that sites have been involved in other studies. it's very easy to see that sites have perhaps recruited well in other studies, but it's also very good to have that experience or at least that recommendation. So I think looking at AROs and key opinion leaders, local national leaders, that sort of thing, they have access to a really rich amount of data on sites and investigators that they know and obviously are peers to. So it's critical certainly in large studies, I think, to have that relationship, because if things perhaps are a little bit more difficult for the sites or there's a problem with the site moving on, then obviously we have that relationship and can easily perhaps go and find out really what the real reason is why perhaps the site's not recruiting, or if there are problems that they don't want to necessarily talk to a CRA about. Integrated technologies is also an interesting one, and obviously back in when we started this, technology really wasn't out there, and so it's been interesting to see that evolve. And I think technology is one of those areas where I think it could go anywhere. I remember one of my colleagues that started out in the industry, he never thought that EDC systems would ever get off the ground. He just felt that that was too much, and obviously that's very much the norm. We wouldn't do paper data collection nowadays, but we do need to be careful, because I think technology can take over, and we need to continue to make that streamlined. We need to make it easy for the sites to collect their data. They're also moving to electronic document collection as far as electronic patient records. So we need to look at, well, how do they fit together? And I think that gives challenges to the CRAs that go out on site, but I think we can continue to exploit that in the future. And I hear good things about technology that's being developed that will perhaps even allow us to do more sightless, perhaps monitoring and clinical research, because if we can get access to that information, why would we need to send a CRA onto site? And then obviously ultimately all of this technology needs to lead to transparent metrics. We need to know what's going on, especially if we're not going to be at the sites as often as we have done traditionally. So competitive investigator fees, this is something that's obviously, you can see it from both ways. I think it's an easy fix to turn around and say, let's give the sites more money, but it's also expensive. So what we need to do is look at effective ways to ensure that what we are spending with our site budgets, we're getting that value back, and also making it simple so that the sites are not having to turn around to us and say, yes, you need to give us all of this extra money because your study's complicated. Excuse me. Robust recruitment and retention plans. Again, in any study, this is critical, but when you're talking about thousands of patients, months of patient data, then obviously it's critical that we get this and we keep the patients in the study. You'll know, if you've worked on these types of studies, most often these are intention to treat, so the patient stays in the study regardless of whether they ever took medication, or if they decide that they don't want to be take the medication, or they don't want to be involved in the study. So we need to ensure that that's kept as a minimum. Sorry. Nancy and I have worked on a really interesting study where although we saw some patients coming off drug, we actually came up with a strategy to encourage those patients to come back on drug. And that was allowed within the protocol because we looked at the data and decided it was better for patients to actually, even though they'd had a break, they were to come back onto medication. Smart and adaptive monitoring. And again, this is something that's quite interesting because we did this back in 20 years ago when we did the first outcome studies. And it's interesting to see that back then, we called it reduced SDV, but now it's sort of turned into remote monitoring, adaptive monitoring, targeted monitoring. And it's interesting to see that, other therapeutic areas are also taking up that now.
Well, Karen, that brings up a great question. If there's ever an area where RBM type approaches make sense. It seems to be this one, yet it's been my impression that occasionally a sponsor will nevertheless demand something that approaches 100% SDV. So how do you see it? Are you getting that sentiment or not out in the field?
Not so much with cardiovascular. I think because of the nature of the studies, the size. I mean, if you think about it, I think most CRO service budgets, I think monitoring probably takes up about 50%. So it's a huge saving if we can do this. And again, interestingly enough, 20 or so years ago when we did a thrombolysis trial back then, we actually targeted, I think it was only 10% SDV with a minimum of 2 patients per site. When we did the analysis at the end of that, I think because some sites didn't recruit the 10 patients, the target was around 15%, the actual was around 15%. Again, interestingly enough, on a recent study that Nancy's working on, the sponsor decided to target it at about 30%. So it's gone up slightly over the years, but we routinely see probably something between 20 and 30% SDV targets. And if you think about it, really what you need to do is you need to check the data that would affect the result of the study. A slightly wrong date of birth, a slightly wrong sort of one digital place of a lab value, that doesn't change the result of a study, unless obviously that value is critical to the outcome.
Well, Karen, hi. I just had a question. It's very insightful presentation. Thank you. It just brought out a thought to me. Do you see CROs taking the lead in their partnerships with AROs nowadays? I mean, it sounds like things are constantly or ever changing.
Yeah, I mean, again, Nancy and I are working on a study, and the relationship between ourselves, the ARO, and the sponsor is very, very even. I think perhaps sometimes you see a more of a hierarchical structure, but I think where it works best is to have that sort of joint communication, joint plan. I think for any aspect of any clinical research, communication is key. But here, I think it's important that the sponsor knows what the ARO knows, what the CRO knows, and that has worked really well in, as I say, a current study that Nancy and I are working on.
It seems to me, team, that these large studies invite so many different hypotheses that sometimes I get the impression that we're making them much more complicated than they have historically been. I liken it to kind of adding barnacles to the bottom of a ship. You just keep adding additional questions, and they're very meritorious and quite interesting. But I'm just wondering, Tony, Nancy, and Karen, are you seeing that in these studies? Too many questions, too many sub-studies, too many different hypotheses? Is that part of it?
It can be. I think, Tony, you'll remember a big study that we worked on where there's lots of different things going on, and it's critical to find the right balance. Genomics and those sorts of things, collecting extra blood samples can be simple, and I think are critical for the future. But then we've done, I think, Nancy, for a study we're working on now, there was an echo subsidy, and that was a challenge because you not only have to collect it, but I think we had some challenges around qualifying, or not necessarily qualifying, but getting the sites to send in scans for qualification.
Right.
No, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say too that it's there's kind of a healthy balance between what the ARO would are suggesting that we do, the sponsor, but I also think that the regulatory agencies have a big impact as well, and we'll talk a little bit later about an operational issue. But I'm also finding that the FDA, for example, may require a certain amount of data or a certain set of data to be collected in these large studies, which just add to the complexity and do add to the cost for sponsors. So they're a little bit they may not have originally thought they were going to need to collect, as you said, Karen, all of that echo data, but it was really again a requirement from the FDA that they have a certain number of echo scans from thousands and thousands of patients, and that adds to the cost and complexity.
Yeah, I was just going to support what both of you are saying. Essentially, as Karen remembers, yes, we were both involved in a very, I think at the time it was the largest trial ever proposed and conducted in cardiovascular diseases. And at that time, there were a significant number of sub-studies, but so it can end up markedly increasing the complexity of the overall concept of one single trial. So if you got a team and an organizational structure that can support this, that's one thing. But as a rule, we always like to remember that there has to be focus on the main goals of the trial. So if you happen to have the organizational structure and heft to support those the multitude of sub-studies that are there, that's fine. But I would lean really towards focusing on one common goal of the primary study.
Hey, Tony, it seems to me that the role of the medical monitor is changing here too. I mean, as you look back over the last few years, do you see the medical monitor really having a step-up role in terms of interface with AROs in particular?
Oh, most definitely. Nowadays, in the past, the medical monitor really was very specific to the trial and site-facing. But nowadays, more and more, you see the medical monitor getting more involved in the strategy of the design, in the strategy of the process, in the strategy of the trial conduct, interfacing with the steering committee, as well as the operational team and the sites and investigators.
Wow. Well, it's such a complex system, and just managing all the different diverse points of view is such a challenge. Nancy, I mean, where is the patient in all of this? I mean, it seems to me that we have to manage so many different aspects of a patient's presentation, either controlling for it in the design or adjusting for it in the analysis. I mean, what's been your experience and your reaction in the community, for example, in lifestyle modification? Are you seeing something interesting there?
Yes, thanks, Mike. There has been a lot of very interesting, I guess, developments and strategies and feedback that we've gotten about, lifestyle modification programs, and really, just kind of thinking about what Tony, presented around lifestyle modification, and really how successful are we in being able to influence that, and what kind of data do we have. So I'd really like to, ask the participants a poll question first before we dive into this topic, and really ask you, what percentage of cardiovascular subjects do you think are not very interested in a formal lifestyle modification program? Give you a few minutes to take a look at that and answer it. And Liz, you just let me know when we've got our responses in.
Sure, just giving a couple more votes coming in now.
Okay, great.
All right, sharing the results.
Okay, very, very interesting. So most of you thought that a lot of the subjects would be interested in a formal lifestyle modification program, and so just to give you a little bit more background, I think that's again interesting responses, because we have some recent data and some recent challenges around, putting a lifestyle modification program into a large cardiovascular outcome study, and we really had to look at, specifically, what kind of modalities, what kind of, processes were we going to put in place, knowing that, one, it was, large numbers of subjects. And as Karen mentioned, the nature of these studies is that they're global, so we had multiple countries involved. And what kind of a diet and exercise, programs could we put in place that we really thought were effective? And, as we start to develop these plans, it was kind of the sky's the limit. Let's look at all the possible ways we could engage, these patients. while they're in the study, and they were going to be in the study for a long time. So we really, were very optimistic at the beginning about how we would be able to affect this outcome. So we, really looked at everything. We looked at, a recipe book, kind of a, really traditional recipe book where we had to spend time, customizing the recipes. As you can imagine, a recipe for a certain, dish in Poland is much different than how it would be presented in Mexico. So we really had to spend a lot of time and work with a specialized company to develop these recipes and really look at creating a recipe book. We didn't think many of the patients would want a recipe book. We really thought they were going to be excited about the technology, and we really spent time and money on a website where once the patients were enrolled in the study, they could go onto this website and they could look at specialized information and motivational information. We gave them access to a lot of healthy lifestyle materials. We gave them the option of having text message reminders about exercise or about even appointments that they had with follow-up visits. We provided them trackers and ways that they could, document, what they, what kind of food, what did they eat for the day, so they could kind of get a perspective of their, of what they're eating. We also found that, a lot of patients really want to have somebody they can talk to specifically about their diet, and a lot of the investigative sites, already would have, a diet and exercise program, but as an added benefit to being in the study, we gave them access to a dietitian. They could call that dietitian someone who would speak to them in their local language, and really have unlimited, one-on-one consultations. And some of the consultations could be very specific because, if you were, if you happen to be diabetic, of course, your diet consultation would be a little bit different than somebody that was not diabetic. And so it was really, really customized. And we really encouraged them to participate in some type of a weight loss program. At the beginning of the study, we had a lot of discussions about, should we provide vouchers for people to go to an exercise program? Should we, provide them a membership to, something like, like Weight Watchers? But we really found that when you look at it globally, not all of those healthy lifestyle or, programs are available to everybody. So we wanted to make sure that all patients had this access to the same types of tools. And so, as part of the program, we just encourage them to, modify their exercise, increase their exercise a little bit as they participate in the study. So, so I'd like to talk a little bit about, we were able to collect a lot of metrics around, how these tools, were they really used? Did the subjects really use them? And one of the ways we were able to do that is we did provide the sites with a tablet, with an iPad, where they could, when the subjects came in for their visits, they could watch a short video about, hope you're doing great with your diet and exercise, and can you tell us, kind of, we would ask them some survey questions. And so I'd like to share those survey results with you and just really, show you, what we found. And, most subjects were not interested in, lifestyle modification program, and they really, they did confirm that they understood the purpose and the importance of it, but, over half of the subjects were really very minimally engaged. They really weren't as interested as we all thought they would be interested. And, there really wasn't a strong consensus about what they found to be the most helpful. I will say, just from my observation, again, we didn't think all the patients would want to have a hard copy recipe book, but we found out they really did like that. They really did like the paper. They really did like having something they could take with them from the site. And most of the patients did not take advantage of speaking to the the dietitian, they were aware of it, but they, really were not, interested in talking to the dietitian. We did have, over half of the subjects participate in some kind of alternative program. Some of those were, like I said, maybe Weight Watchers or some other local program that they had access to. And, really in a very short amount of time, the patients did lose, they lost their enthusiasm for any of the tools, that we had given them. And we asked them a lot, what would have helped? Like, was there something else we could have provided that would have helped you stay motivated or helped you stay kind of stick to the program? And there really wasn't anything really a consensus that that we could that we could get from the survey. We did get a lot of feedback from the sites, and I think one of the comments that we a lot of the comments that we got that was consistent was that these patients really like the one-on-one interaction with either their physician or with a nurse or with somebody there at the site that can sit down with them and talk. They like that personal interaction. That the technology was not something that necessarily they were they had really warmed up to. So lots of interesting observations. The patient population was because of the nature of the study and the inclusion and exclusion criteria, the patients were a little bit older. So we did feel like that the technology maybe was they weren't comfortable with a lot of the technology that we suggested. There were some regulatory hurdles, as everybody can imagine. All of these patient-facing materials, had to be reviewed and approved by the regulatory agencies. And you'd be interested. It's interesting to note, comments. Maybe they didn't like a particular recipe or they didn't like a particular ingredient that was part of the recipe, and they would, delay the approval so we could adjust the recipe book. So lots of interesting information about and just interactions that we've had on all levels, not only with the patients but with the sites and also the regulatory agencies.
Nance, we hear so much about wearable devices and the role of technology, and at first blush it's very attractive. And we've attempted a number of programs, but I'm just wondering, when you think about the expense of it and the complexity operationally, sometimes I get the impression that we are simply awash with data, but not necessarily with information. How do you see it? How do you see this rolling out?
Yeah. Well, I think the technology component of it is another really interesting, observation. I think, all of us, we use all of this technology, a lot. I mean, we sit at computers and we have smartphones and we have all of this technology at our fingertips, and we have good, internet connection, and we have Wi-Fi and all those bells and whistles. And what we really found is, and even in the U.S. that the technology is still a barrier to. You can collect the data, as you said, Mike, but it's inconsistent. Even I mentioned about the tablets, and we just thought the tablets were really cool, and the sites could have another tool to be able to engage the subjects, and little did we know that a lot of the sites can't access Wi-Fi, and that's the only way the tablet can sync with a system to be able to get that data. As your point is, to get the data to download, they have to have access to Wi-Fi. And we're getting calls from study coordinators telling us that they have to run across the street to Starbucks to get access to Wi-Fi so they can sync up and get the data. So it was really eye-opening for us to see what the implications were for technology.
And I had a question, Nancy. So how did age and gender affect subject use of this technology? Was that even a factor?
We didn't look at gender specifically. We did look at just the age and overall the median age for the subjects in this particular study was around 65. So, you know, we did think that was a barrier, is that, you know, although I think we all know a lot of, you know, 65-year-olds that you know are really tech savvy. It's not, but we do think that age in this particular survey, yeah, you know, that was one of the barriers. But we did find just culturally, you know, we had some countries, for example, that just refused to use the you know, the tablet, the iPad.
Well, you know, carrying it further, Nancy, what about the role of culture and country, standards of care? I mean, doesn't this put an overlay of additional complexity on all this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, and just you know, the role of having the investigator, and that's, you know, the site staff, you know, talk to the subjects about lifestyle modifications, and are they really, you know, I guess modeling, you know, that behavior. There's as you said, there's a lot of cultural, you know, issues around food, and you know, that also came up as we, you know, developed these recipe books and looked at different ingredients, or what kind of food is even available. You know, we may think that it's easy for, you know, a patient to get access to, you know, healthy fruits and vegetables, and that's not really always the case. That it's a chore for them to travel to you know, an area where they can get fresh fruits and vegetables. That it's much easier for them to kind of fall back into their old habits. Yeah.
Yeah, and Nancy, I guess also, you know, patients of that sort of age, I mean, they're probably going to have very traditional diets too. So, you know, and some of that isn't necessarily always healthy, but also, you know, at that age, I guess, you know, cooking new types of food, and as you say, having availability to that food is definitely going to be a factor. Yeah. Especially some of the geographies. I mean, these studies are becoming, you know, truly global, and it's not just even European diets, it's South American diets, South African diets, Asia Pacific diets.
Yes, it's very challenging, and I think, you know, the only, you know, the other aspect of this is really the family, you know, and how, you know, is it possible in the future for us to, you know, if these types of lifestyle modification programs are going to be critical to, you know, future protocols, or how, you know, how we need to proceed with protocols. You know, we need to think about how we can engage the family also in modifying, you know, because it's really a family lifestyle, you know, issue.
Absolutely. I think we've all been there where, you know, one member of the family is on a diet, and unless you can encourage everybody to eat similarly, it becomes a big chore to cook 3-4 different meals every day.
Right. And then if you have some other, if you have some other type of, if you're diabetic, or you have some other comorbidity, you know, there has to be some very, you know, if you have renal disease or other, you know, comorbidities, you just need to, you know, then the diet has to be modified even differently than others. Yeah.
Well, you know, we just got a question then that's really interesting, and it really relevant to what Karen and Nancy have been saying. And you know, this question we get so many times. So here it is: do you find staff turnover rates to be a significant factor in maintaining the scientific integrity of the study? Basically, or does the nature of what you folks are doing, does it really permit a much more flexible approach to staffing solutions?
Mm-hmm.
It's a bit of both. So yes, I mean, there is always going to be a challenge when you run a long-term study, regardless of size, because the ideal is you have the person that starts the study finish the study. So it does have that challenge from a time perspective, but also what it gives us is a fantastic opportunity to develop staff. So, you know, you have to plan in advance of this, and really sort of think, well, you know, what individuals are on my study, and what can we do to develop them over the course of the study. And Nancy will remember that even the program that we're working on now, we've had some great successes. I can't remember how many it was now, but we have a number of lead CRAs that became lead CRAs and PMs that have become lead CRAs. Nancy, Matt, you probably remember.
Yeah, we've had great success over the years in you know, bringing CRAs onto the program, and you know, looking at their development and developing them into, you know, lead CRAs, and then we've had many of our lead CRAs. I think we've had, you know, 3 or 4 lead CRAs that then have developed into, you know, being able to be a project manager on the study, and then they have a significant amount of time to, you know, to work on a large team of project managers so they can develop their skills, so that, you know, the long-term goal would be, you know, that they can manage a project, you know, independently. So we've had a lot of success. The other success we've had is just really, you know, keeping our CRAs. You know, if you think about these large studies, the number of sites, you know, many of our CRAs in the U.S. are you know, they're all regional based. Many of them, you know, are able to, you know, drive to their sites. They are able to have the same sites for many, you know, for many years. They like the stability. They like the consistency. They like, you know, being, you know, very local. And we've had a really, you know, high success in you know, in keeping, you know, maintaining our original, you know, team of CRAs. And as Karen mentioned, you know, our original team of, you know, of project managers as well. Just knowing that, you know, we've been able to develop people along the way. So it's really is a good opportunity.
You know, I think that's really important, actually, to not only be able to develop your your CRAs, which keeps them interested in remaining within the company, but the ability to bring in new CRAs whom you can then manage, train, and keep and promote, hopefully, to higher levels. I know it sounds like you're creating a bit of a vacuum at that CRA end, but based on what you're saying, it seems to work very well with our company. Is that not correct?
Yeah, and I think them, you know, people seeing that you know, people want to then, you know, come and join us and come and join the team. So it's been enlightening, and I think, you know, finally, Nancy, you know, you've been on that study from the beginning. I think, you know, that you know, lends itself as well from the oversight being the same as well. So that's been a critical. So we, you know, from our commitment from a senior level, we've also made that commitment to keep, you know, the oversight stable as well, which I think helps.
Yes, it's really such a challenge to do this. Well, you know, ladies and gentlemen, in the time that we have left, I thought it might take a minute just to summarize at least what I think the highlights of today's discussions were about. First, we heard Tony really show us a very rich and more provocative and more complex knowledge of the disease processes, is really breaking down and disrupting some of the somewhat arbitrary boundaries we've erected over the years between therapeutic areas. One can just as easily see an immunological-based strategy in cardiovascular disease, in IMID type disorders, or frankly central nervous system disorders. So as we get a deeper appreciation of pathophysiology, we get a sense that these agents can target multiple different conditions. We also heard from Karen something which we all know is true. When a study works beautifully, it's because it's been organized beautifully. And the ability to manage diverse stakeholders is really very important, all of whom will look at the data through vastly different prisms, really like the conversation regarding integrated technology, the recruitment and retention plans. Cardiovascular outcome studies really have a challenge in that regard because they're very long. And of course, the recurring theme regarding smart and adaptive monitoring for very efficient programs. And then finally, Nancy highlighted the importance of, you know, the common word that's bantered about quite a bit is patient centrality. The management of multiple chronic comorbidities in the context of cardiovascular disease certainly has an implication for program design, and it ripples into all the different techniques we might consider for lifestyle management. And so, you know, raises the question, how will we accommodate differences in cultures and standards of care? And as Nancy was talking, I was thinking about the literature on the Mediterranean diet, you know, which is really an interesting dossier of information, specifically directed towards CV outcomes. So I think what we're hearing is a very exciting mosaic of possibilities. There's innumerable implications, I think, for the relationships between the pharmaceutical industry and academia and contact research organizations. And I just think it was a brilliantly interesting conversation, and I wish we had more time. But Liz, I think we're going to need to transition out at this moment.
Thank you, Dr. Murphy, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to thank you, the audience, for taking the time to connect with our worldwide experts. We were inspired by the discussion today, and I hope you were too. Contact us to continue the conversation. If you asked a question today that we were not able to get to, we will contact you individually. As I mentioned earlier, this webinar has been recorded, and all attendees will receive a link to the on-demand recording. For more information about Worldwide, we invite you to visit worldwide.com. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar and hope you have a wonderful rest of the day.